Is it recording? Yeah. Okay. Hi everyone. So my name is Lauren. I want to talk to you about component best practices today. For those of you that don't know me, I work at Dockyard. My name is Lauren, obviously, and I moved here from Australia in April. And so far it's been. Oh, did it turn off? Oh, yeah. Okay. Anyway, I don't really have many slides, so I'm just gonna kill this. And we're gonna look at some code today. So as part of this talk, I built, one sec. Yeah, as part of this talk, I built a demo app. You can find the source on my GitHub, potato slash component best practices. I'll post it into the chat later. But anyway, um, the whole point of this talk was because as we move forward in the Ember 2x cycle, we're going to find that components are going to become more and more significant in Ember, uh, especially when routable components land and controllers go away. As far as I know, routable components are currently blocked by the second version of Glimmer and the new pod structure. I might be wrong, but we can expect it to land pretty soon. Angle bracket components and contextual components are also in the pipeline, and this will fit in very nicely with the whole data down, actions up philosophy that a lot of people have been talking about. That's something I will cover a little bit later because I want to start off with a simple best practice and keep this whole thing a little bit informal and like a pair programming session. So if you have any questions, feel free to ping me. I'll explain. And if I don't know the answer to it, I blame RWJ Blue. You can check the site out, Ember WTF. Alright, back to the talk. So the first pro tip is, this is a bit hard to read. When you need to declare an object or an array as a component property. So for example, you might want to have some sort of simple component cache or just some static items that you want to iterate through, like t-shirt sizes, for example, that don't need to be backed by like a Ember data record collection. However, there is a very slight gotcha here. Because if you declare an object or array directly on a component definition, it's actually shared among all instances of that component. And that's because all the instances will actually point to the same reference for that object or array. So in this bad example, this component has a internal property for sizes, and you'll notice when I add a size, something unexpected happens. And even though I'm editing the Tom Dale t-shirt, somehow it also got added to the Yehuda Cat t-shirt, which is most of the time not what you want. But there are there's certain scenarios where you actually do want this behavior, so it's important to be aware of how to do that. And then obviously the good example, each component has their own state. So if I do emp sherpa, oh, there's already large, medium, and like tiny. And to do this, you need to basically declare your attributes inside of the init hook instead of doing something like this. So yeah, this is actually quite a big gotcha because it's not intuitive at all. Like you think like, oh, I'll just declare this and every component will get its own size attribute, but it's not. So to do that, in your init hook, you have to remember to call super, which is a best practice. And then you basically just set the sizes or whatever property you want in there. And important thing to note is that you can use a normal JavaScript setter. You don't have to use set, Ember set. And that's because when the component init hook is called, at that point bindings haven't been set up yet. So calling set won't actually do anything and can actually cause performance degradation. So when you are in the init hook, you can use ordinary JavaScript setters, which is really nice. Oops, sorry. Okay, so that's the first tip. It's a very simple one. The next tip is, oh, also before I forget, in this demo you can click on this big view source button and you can see the source code directly. Actually, I might just post a link to this right now so that you can all play with it. Okay. Alright. So the next thing is you saw I used this super argument in the previous example. This is best practice, especially when you override framework methods, because certain methods will actually need to do setup. For example, the most common troll is in routes where you forget to call um, this dot super in setup controller, and then your controller no longer has a model, and then you're like super confused, like what happened there? So as a best practice, it's always good to have this super argument. This is ES6 syntax, and if you are not comfortable with, or if you're not using Babel for some reason, you can just do apply this argument, which is the equivalent of that. So in this demo, you can see like this actually throws an error because the base component for these two examples was doing some setup, and then this bad one forgot to call the super method. So it just broke. Whereas this one works, which is great. The 3D, cool. So that's a simple one. And in case you want to see the code for that, super, it's just literally like that in any framework hook, or even if you're extending from another component, like here I'm extending from a shared base example. It's always good to call this super argument if you're extending or overriding a method that already lives on this component. All right. So now I actually want to talk about data down, actions up, because that is something that is very important going forward with Ember 2.0. What it basically is unidirectional data flow, or it basically means data flows in one way. I actually wrote a blog post about this very recently. Just wanted to show you the diagram. Yeah. So in Ember 2.0, especially when routable components land, this is what your app will look like from a very high level. You have an API, which will hit the Ember data adapter and serializer layer. This gets pushed into your store, and then from there, your route accesses the data from the store, passes it into the routable component, which will replace controllers. And then these will basically, all the actions and all the attributes will be passed into this routable component, and then from there, you can pass it into any child component. So any actions that your child components or even the routable component calls will flow back upwards into your API. And that is a lot simpler mental model to understand compared to traditional MVC where you have things being mutated everywhere and it's really hard to reason about and catch bugs, especially when you have cascading updates, like you update one object and another object updates, which triggers another update. And then all of a sudden you've like updated like a million things and you have no idea why. So that's always really bad. So one of the simplest ways you can do data down actions up right now is to figure out who owns the data. So in your components, I've noticed that some people will pass in the model directly into the component, and then in a component action, you modify the record there. That's actually a very bad practice because then you no longer know where the source of mutation is, and you fall into that trap of cascading updates. So these demos, I mean, they're pretty similar in terms of their UI. They're all linked. Um, Let me show the example. So in my example, I was doing stuff in the component in this bad example. So I was doing save. I was saving it here. I could probably like modify things, like whatever. And then like this is very dangerous. Instead, what you should do, instead of modifying your records or data in your component, in order to prepare your applications for Ember 2.0, the data down actions philosophy is instead to send actions upwards instead, and then only let the things that um, own the data modify it. So in this demo, I've actually put it on the controller, but I actually just worked on an add-on yesterday with Rob, and this will actually let you bubble up your actions to routes, which is a lot nicer. And when routable components um, land, since controllers are going to go away, you're going to have to move all your actions and your computed properties and whatever into either the routable component or the route. Actions will live on your route. So you can actually start using this add-on today and start begin moving your actions into the route and move them out of your controller. So you can try and keep your controllers as lean as possible. And this add-on is just a simple helper. So instead of calling the normal action helper, you just call route dash action. And on this route, if the route for this, I mean the route.js file for the route um, doesn't have the action, it will bubble up and it will try and find it. So in this case, it hits the application route. So this is really nice. And then I'm also working on a pull request to have return values. So currently, in version 0.1 of this add-on, it just bubbles. It doesn't have a return value. But when I get this PR merged and Rob is happy with it, you'll be able to do something like, where's the example? Yeah, like this. So you can call the action and it will have a return value and you can do stuff with it, whatever you want. And that's really cool. Oh, sorry, back to here. Yeah, so as I was saying, keep your actions out of um, your controller, move them into the route, and don't modify data and components, and then have the actions in the route handle them instead. So that's probably one of the easiest things you can do right now to get your apps compliant with data and actions up. Yeah, I noticed Mike says returning promises from actions, and yes, you can do that. So that means in your component you can actually do something like an async action where you save the model in the route and then that returns a promise and you can put a loading spinner in your component or you can handle rejections and stuff like that. Yeah, okay. So do we have any questions at this point? Is everyone good with data and actions out? It is, yes, but if you wanted to do something like where is the readme? Uh, route action, and then you do like a mut. I mean, that wouldn't work because it wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't be able to do the mut helper in a route action. Does that make sense? Just now. Well, I'm not. Yeah, it's right now. So yeah, it's this is like 2 days worth of work. So there's a lot of work more we need to do on this add-on. But using it now, you'll be able to bubble up actions and you can do currying stuff like that, and sub expressions all work as well. I'll link to the graphic. I'll post it in the chat. Okay. So now let's talk about closure actions since we're on the topic. Um, I'm actually planning to write a blog post about this pretty soon, on my blog, which I just linked in the chat. Where's my... Yeah, because I feel sometimes with Synaction, it's a little bit of an anti-pattern. Anti-pattern might be a strong word, but um, I think Synaction makes you a little bit lazy, and it's very implicit as opposed to being explicit with closure actions. And the real benefit of closure actions is, well, I like to think of it as a benefit is you can have a lot less code, which is a good thing because less code means less bugs, and less bugs means you're a happy developer. Where's my folder? Closures, yes. So in this example, I have these two inputs. They basically look up posts from Reddit depending on the subreddit you find. So find posts, you might want to do something like ask Reddit, find controversial posts, or you might want to find all the best posts from awe. Um, so in this case, you can see that in the bad example, I have to do a lot of unnecessary definitions of like my um, so my bad example is the parent of this top post component, and that means that the actions need to be passed explicitly down into all the child components, and then the child component has to define an action where it sends this.send action. So this is like old school Ember, where you pass in a string as an action, like that. So this, if you handle actions this way in your components, this would mean that you have to define a lot of unnecessary files. A lot of times you don't actually even need to define a subclass component. So you'll see in my good example, I don't even have a component.js. It's just templates all the way. With closure actions, you can pass in the actual function itself, and then you have return values, so you can handle promises, things like that there. You can make use of these cool helpers like the mut helper. So if you just wanted to mutate something, and you don't want to, have to update it manually, you just use the mut helper in the action. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with this, but this is a handlebar sub-expression. So it will evaluate this in like the parentheses and update it there. The one-way input is a nice little add-on I'll cover later, where it also lets you do the data down actions up pattern. So instead of this input being bound to changes in the value directly, it will emit an action called update, and then you can handle that action however you like. So that's also a really nice simple way of um, using one-way bindings like right now. And then in the good example, in the child component, you'll note, so this top post is a child of good example. So in the template, I passed in, where is my select post. So select post comes from an attrs, also called select post, and you'll see in the route for that, I have select post as action mut selected post. So whenever this action is called, it will take the first argument from whatever is passed back into this and mutate selected posts with that value. And then passing it down is super simple because you can access it this.address.select post in your template directly. So you don't even need to have a subclass component. But sometimes you might want to. For example, you might want to set other values, or you might do things like that. And then that is also really simple because you can do, um, the action in the component. And then in that component, if you were to use the closure action instead, like this dot adders that select post, then you actually have return values. So like I showed you in the route action helper, this is a really nice thing to do when you need to handle promises or anything async. So that's it for closures. I think they're like one of the coolest additions to Ember, and I think a lot of people will benefit, a lot of applications will benefit by moving ordinary string actions to closure actions. So before I move on, do we have any questions for this topic? Okay, cool. So this is another small one. I was gonna talk about it as part of the Ember one-way input because you might be wondering, like, with Glimmer and the fact that you can now do native one-way input, like, why do you need this add-on to handle a one-way input? So there's actually a really strange bug, and this is a little bit beyond me. It's to do with the way HTML bars and Glimmers parses DOM attributes. But you'll notice, so this example, where is my input? DOM matter. Yep. So this is a native input. I'm not even using the bracket input template helper. So you on the input, I'm calling another closure action where I mute mut foo, and I'm passing in the event targets value. But you'll notice something really strange, like in the middle of this string, if I were to add a space, you'll see my cursor jumped to the back, and that's really weird. So if I wanted to type something in the middle, like I can't. It's like weird Bob. Nope. So the Ember one-way input fixes that. I believe that Rob will eventually make this a part of Ember itself. But this is a potential gotcha in case you wanted to start using native one-way inputs, but then you notice this strange bug. So if you do encounter this bug, you can bring in the Ember one-way input add-on, which is also based off of Rob's awesome JS bin. Currying ability. Okay, I have. So Matt's asking a question about currying with closure actions. Um, when it's good to use them. Basically, if I mean currying is it's a very useful thing. I can't really say what exactly the best scenarios for using currying is because it's so dependent on your application. But it can be very useful. So actually in the um, route action helper add-on, I in my test I have a example of currying set up. Let me see where it is. Oh, and if anyone wants to know what this add-on is, I mean this Chrome extension is, it's called Octotree. It's really good. I can't use GitHub without it. So what was I saying? Templates. So in my route action here, you'll see I'm passing get max 1, 5, and 10 as arguments. that's currying, in the sense that when I eventually call this action from the component, um, the value that I pass in here is added to uh, the the argument. So I mean, this could be useful if you're doing a lot of nested components where they have like you have like polymorphic components. So you might have a certain like animal or something, and you have different components for different kind of animals, but they're all animals. And then you want to like do some sort of currying. So those scenarios could be useful. But yeah, I don't really think I can list off a list of like when it's good to curry. I think it really depends on the nature of your application, if that makes sense. But yeah, so to do currying, it's very simple. You can basically pass in arguments at every step of where you define the action. So in here, this is the component for the template for foobar component. I'm calling the action getMax with 20. And then in the component, I don't think I have a component yet. Yeah, it's just gonna call the action. And then it will just get passed along to this, and then you'll have 1, 5, 10, 20. So the value of getMax is gonna be 20. Okay. All right, let's get back to this thing. Now, another thing I like to talk about is the new component lifecycle hooks. I'm actually going to close the console for this. These are like probably one of the best additions to Ember because if you've ever used something like React, React basically inspired a lot of these hooks in the sense that you can handle actions differently. Because the thing is, when Glimmer got built and merged into 1.13, this means that re-rendering components are now like super fast. So that means we no longer need to care about when to re-render, and we can just let Glimmer take care of it. So you'll notice in this little playground, I basically set up a little table of the different events that get called when you modify external and internal attributes. I actually think these hooks aren't very well documented. I don't believe they're in the guides, but the best place to look for them is I think component. There's a blog post where Yehuda mentions this. I think it's in this one. I'll paste that into Slack. So, oh, sorry. This link to the yep here. So yeah, unfortunately this isn't in the guide for some reason, but it is in the blog, so you can take a look at the new hooks there. So the most important hooks I believe that you should be using are the did init receive update adder hooks. For the will did render update hooks, these are not as commonly used in your applications. I mean, you don't really need to use them unless you're doing some sort of really heavy performance optimization where you're trying to block rendering. But because Glimmer is so efficient with free renders, you don't really need to care. And using these hooks are actually quite dangerous because you can potentially cause infinite loops. For example, if you in the did render hook, that's actually called every time the component has finished rendering. And then if you set a value inside of did render, you will cause an infinite loop because setting a value on your component in the did render will cause another re-render and it will cause another re-render and you set the value so it's like infinite and it's turtles everywhere. And yes, Matt asked another question. Yes, these hooks are available on all components. If you're on Ember 1.13 and later, you can use these hooks. And I will talk a little bit later about how you can actually remove observers with this hook because observers are evil. Alright, so just as a quick demo, you'll notice I'm modifying an external attribute here. So this is an attribute that is being passed from the outside into the component. So I can type something foo. You'll see that every time I hit my key, it actually re-rendered. And something you might be surprised to note is that the initial render is a lot slower than the re-renders. Um, so when Glimmer was released, there was a lot of effort into getting re-renders working really fast. But at that point, nobody realized that initial renders would slow down so drastically. So the new version of Glimmer that Yehuda and Tom and all the other smart people are working on, you can actually take a look at the progress with that. I'm not sure when the new version of Glimmer will land in Ember, but hopefully it's soon because I believe it actually significantly improves initial render time, which is great. And because Ember is committed to um, smooth and easy upgrades, you'll be able to upgrade your Ember app and get those updates without anything breaking, hopefully. So yeah, I modified an external attribute. All these hooks got called. You can take a look at the demo and play with this and see. And then you'll notice that all the adder hooks got called. It's important to note that these attribute hooks will only be called when you pass in um, values from the outside, and they will not be called if you modify internal state. So for example, if I set a property foo on the component, and I type bar, um, these hooks did not get called. You see the last value was foo. And these hooks also receive arguments, which you can see on the right. You can do some fancy optimization if you like handling differences between the old and new attributes. But otherwise, I think this is probably the most useful hook, did receive adders, because using this hook you can handle new attributes that come in and when your component re-renders, and this will actually let you get rid of observers completely. Because using this hook will also force you to architect your components with a data down, actions up philosophy, because you'll want them to be external attributes so that when they change, you can handle them. So that's good. So yeah, I won't go into too much detail into these hooks. Um, there's a lot of uh, well, I mean, you can basically play around with this and figure it out. All right, so let's go talk about observers. Um, I think we all know that observers are bad. Stefan Penner, most famously, he's given a few talks on observers, and observers are. I always hear this question like, if observers are so bad, why are they in Ember? Well, the reason is observers are used by Ember itself as a low-level binding, and it's used so that you don't have to use them yourself. Because using observers comes with a lot of gotchas. You have to remember to remove them. You have to remember to know how to actually add an observer. For example, there's this like little trick that a lot of people know where you have to invoke an observer after adding it, because if nothing is consuming the observer, it doesn't fire, and then you're left confused. So in these examples, they all do the same thing. So what I wanted to show was that you can very easily refactor away observers. So if my birthday was, let's say, I'm really old, 1950, I'm 65 years old. You can do the same with observe without observers. There are multiple ways of doing this. For example, a computed property. This is especially useful if you're not setting values outside and you just want to decorate something. So that's useful. And then the alternative is using did receive adders. I also talk about a blog post here, which I go into more detail. I'll paste that. But let me go through the source really quickly. Observers. So in my bad example, I am adding an observer on init. And this is instead of using the observer method, not this one. So there are multiple ways of adding observers. You can use ember.observer, or you can also use add observer, which is a method on Ember objects. I just use this because it's simpler to remove uh, observers when you destroy them. So if for some reason you have an observer and it's difficult to remove from your application, it's very important to remember to remove the observer when components are torn down, because if you don't, they will just keep running, and as your application is used longer and longer, there's going to be memory leaks. Seth, do you have a question? Yep. So Seth asked a question about using a throttled run loop to call an outside API, and you can't use the computed property because it won't throttle. And yes, you can actually use did receive adders and respect the throttle. Um, what will happen is did receive adders will keep getting called, but you can easily add a debounce inside of that hook, and you can handle it there. I think in one of my add-ons, that's what I do. If you want to take a look at that as an example, I think it's called hypersearch. This is like a simple so type ahead search for hitting APIs when you don't really want the records. You just want to get some simple JSON and render that. So you can take a look in there. I have a did receive adders hook in there somewhere. Actually, I don't think I have one. Yeah, because I handle it through the action. But yeah, you can do the same thing in the did receive adders hook. So yeah, in this case, the bad example, if you have to use an observer, please remember to remove them. And then the first example of the good approach is you'll notice that because this observer isn't actually doing much, it's just setting an internal property when this value changes. That is actually what a computed property is for. So in this case, it's a bad use of an observer because you could very simply get rid of all of that crap and replace it with a computed property. This will fire when this thing changes. So this is especially useful if your component needs to observe an internal state. But it gets a bit more complicated when you want to observe changes from the outside of the component, and that's where the did receive adders hook. So one of the reasons why I like this hook so much is because it enforces data down, actions up. In order for this hook to fire when these two values change, they need to be external attributes. So this actually forces you to move data out of your component and back into where they belong, which is in the route or controller if you have to. And then you pass those data dependencies directly into the component. And every time those values change, this method gets called and you can do whatever you want in there. In this case, setting a value inside of this hook is okay because we saw in the playground earlier that um, this method will not get called if you set an internal property, only an external property. But instead, if I had called something like, if I did this, it would probably, I think my browser might crash actually. Let's see. Um, yeah, no, nothing happens. Did it save? Or is it did update? Huh. The deprecation went away. That's weird. But basically, This is bad because I must have architected this really well, so I can't break it. But yeah, don't use did update or the other hooks. This is the main hook you probably want to use. Um, did init adders is also useful if you need to do some sort of defaults. For example, if I wanted to set some sort of internal state based on an external attribute, you can handle it in here. But more often than not, this is 80% of your use case will be with this hook. Okay, so that's pretty good. And then finally, there's another method which I go through in my blog post, which is to use actions. That's also a really good approach. So you send the action back up into the route and then handle whatever you need there. And you make use of things like helpers and computer properties to decorate things. I'm probably not going to go into that because I think we are running a bit out of time. So I will go to my last two. I'm going to talk about this one first. On the topic of helpers, a lot of times in applications, you actually don't need components in a lot of cases. A lot of times, if you notice yourself using components just to take some attribute, do some do something to it, and then just present it in the UI, that's probably not the best use of a component. And instead, you can actually just get by with using a helper. The benefit of using helpers is that they are composable. And because with the latest versions of HTML bars and handlebars, you can do sub-expressions, which is the parentheses inside of the, what do you call it? The double curlies. So that this lets you compose little snippets of functionality in your templates directly. And you can even import the functions in the helpers in your application and use them as normal JavaScript functions. So this is really useful. Again, if you want to have a play with this, you can check out the demo, and you can see how where you might once have used the computer property to set the different colors of the table rows, you can very easily just handle with a helper. So this will turn green if your shoe size matches this size. And if you look at the source for that, where is it? Help. Oh no, not helper. Use helpers. Yeah. You'll see that it's where is the code for that? Yeah, it's very simple because I'm using the helper directly in and passing that value into the class itself. So you don't even need a computer property. You can get away with using a helper. And yeah, because it's composable, you can compose it in other handlebar expressions, and it's super useful. And then there there are also things you can do with helpers that are not super intuitive. For example, if you use the Ember generate helper blueprint in Ember CLI, that will generate the simple version of a helper, which looks like that. So it will export a simple function, and then it will transform that function. It basically adds the compute method on the helper with this little helper method. But you can also opt into the full helper, which is where you extend from the helper class. And then you can do things like compute and return values. And then you notice I actually have an observer here. Unfortunately, in helpers, I've read in the guides that it's good to use observers here. I might be wrong, but because helpers under the hood are actually Ember objects, you can also do things like computer properties. So I'm still exploring the full helper. I haven't really played around with them too much, but my opinion is I like them a lot because they're composable, and a lot of times you just don't really need a component. Okay, so I've talked a lot about data down, actions up, and controllers going away. So that whenever I mention that controllers are gonna die to people who've done Ember, they're always like, why? Controllers are so useful. And in some cases, yes, controllers are very useful because, singleton logic is sometimes necessary in applications. But the main reason why Yehuda, Tom, and the rest of the core team decided to remove controllers is because the majority of their use case was in conjunction with views, and combined the controller and view was actually performing the role of a component. So um, when you refactor controllers away from your app, you actually find that it's not as difficult as you think it might be, because a lot of times you can actually just change the class to component, and if you're not using singleton logic, it should just work. and you might have to update some templates. So I'll show you, as part of my last topic, a simple way of moving logic out of your controller. With the route action helper, you can already get rid of actions in controllers, and with this pattern, you can now also remove singleton logic. So singleton logic basically is logic that needs to persist throughout the application as a single instance. For example, if you have a e-commerce site and you have a shopping cart, you might probably be using a service, you might be using a singleton instance to manage the state of that shopping cart. For example, you might want to add products from different parts of the application, and they are all the same cart. So when you first try to move singleton logic away from controllers, you actually find that if you don't use a service, you find that it's very difficult to restore um, the options when you come back to this route. So I don't have a bad example for this, but because components will get torn down when you go back and out, get out and back, go back into a route, you'll see that their state will just reset and they will completely forget what's in the cart already. So if you imagine this little demo as a shopping cart for buying animals, um, you'll notice that I can add animals to the cart, and even when I go back and come back in, that is still persisted. And this is all done with very little code. So let me go into that. So in my template, I have a simple component called a checkbox group. Apologies if this syntax is weird. This is because I've nested my components inside of pods. So the normal component uh, resolver lookup won't work if you just type checkbox group. So in this case, yeah, in case you're wondering. So I also have a blog post about this, but the core thing, that the core logic that goes in here is the fact that you have a service that manages the state for the shopping cart. So in here, I've just set up a simple array called selected items. And then in my controller, which will eventually become a routable component, or yeah, a routable component, I inject that service there, and then I have an action to handle um, adding and removing items into that service. So that's how my component will be able to modify the state. And then in the checkbox group component itself, I actually don't even have a component.js file. Um, you can you see, so using the power of closure actions and helpers, you can do a lot with very little code. So in here, I'm using helpers like concat, where you concatenate a string, so I can have unique IDs for each of these labels. I can also pass in the value. Actually, the logic for determining how to persist this state is in this one line of, in these like how many, 30 characters. Contains is this little simple helper I made. All it does is it returns a true or false whether or not the item is inside a collection. And with just that little code, I have refactored away my controller, and I have gotten rid of it. And because I'm using the one-way input, I have one-way bindings. I have very explicit data flow in my application, and even though this is a simple example, you can see how this might apply to application. So I've come to the end of my talk. I think, do we have time for more questions? Tareth? Okay. So yeah, happy to go through anything again, or if anyone has more questions. I've posted links to all the slides, but I will do that again. I'll probably tweet them out so you can um, do it. And thank you all for attending the global Ember meetup, and also a big thank you to Ember Sherpa for organizing it. I know a lot of us don't have the luxury of a Ember meetup in our countries, so this is a really nice initiative. And I think we should all thank Ember Sherpa for his hard work in organizing this. And if you'd like to follow me on Twitter or GitHub, you can do so. And thank you. Oh, I forgot to stop recording.